At what point does Israel, and perhaps much of the rest of the world, say enough is enough with Hamas? The toings and froings, the comings and going as regards hostages, the skeletal, and I, again, horrible to use this expression, but near Belson-like appearance of the 3 male hostages who were released on the weekend, who we now understand were regularly hanged upside down, starved, beaten and denied water. How much longer will a country put up with that? When clearly, with dealing with Hamas, it is like trying to wrestle with vapours. You never quite know what you're going to get. Well, it would appear, sadly, time is running out. Now, if you were listening this time yesterday, you'll recall we brought you the update that President Trump had demanded Hamas release all the remaining hostages by 12 noon Sunday, or the ceasefire would be over. Now, the president has positioned himself as a firm ally of Israel during his first few weeks as president, even suggesting plans to rebuild Gaza, turning it into, remember, the Riviera of the Middle East. And he doubled down while speaking to reporters in the Oval Office.
As far as I'm concerned, if all of the hostages aren't returned by Saturday at 12 o'clock, I think it's an appropriate time. I would say cancel it and all bets are off and let hell break out. I'd say they ought to be returned by 12 o'clock on Saturday, and if they're not returned, all of them, not in drips and drabs, not 2 and 1 and 3 and 4 and 2. Saturday at 12 o'clock, and after that, I would say all hell is going to break out, and I don't think they're going to do it.
And another key development comes from Israel, where Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu appears to throw his weight behind these demands. He says he wants to see the hostages returned by Saturday noon. However, he wasn't clear with how many hostages that would be. He also welcomed Trump's plans for Gaza, threatened the army would return to intense fighting if the deadline was not met.
I have just concluded an in-depth 4-hour discussion in the Political Security Cabinet. We all expressed our outrage at the shocking situation of our 3 hostages who were released last Saturday. We all also welcome President Trump's demand for the release of our hostages by Saturday noon. And we also welcome the President's revolutionary vision of the future of Gaza. In light of Hamas's announcement of its decision to violate the agreement and not release our hostages, last night I ordered the army to gather forces inside and around the Gaza Strip. The operation is being carried out at this time. The decision that I passed unanimously in the cabinet is this: if Hamas does not return our hostages by Saturday noon, the ceasefire will end and the army will return to intense fighting until Hamas is finally defeated.
Well, we're certainly counting down the days, if not quite the hours, to that deadline. Let's go first to Yaakov Katz, who's former editor of the Jerusalem Post, senior fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute, and joining me now. How has the news gone down domestically in Israel? Good morning to you.
Good morning, Nick. In Israel, there's a lot of concern, right? Is this going to explode come Saturday and the hostages will not be released? We know that there are still dozens, if not more, who are alive inside the Gaza Strip, and some signs and proof of life have come back since the hostages who were released have returned to Israel, saying we were just with some of your loved ones. So there's a lot of pressure on the ground from the public and, of course, from the families. But at the same time, if Hamas doesn't stick to the terms, and if Trump's terms are not met noon on Saturday, we could find ourselves back into a conflict with fighting.
Yaakov, what of the claims being made by Hamas that aid is being denied getting into the Gaza area?
Hamas has been making these claims since the beginning. I think all you have to do is look at social media and see the proof of how the markets are full, the supermarkets are full, people are eating. And let's also remember, I haven't seen photos and images like Or, Eli, and Ohad, who were returned to Israel on Saturday, emaciated, bringing back the harsh horror of the memories of the Holocaust from 80-something years ago of how Jews were once liberated. We don't see those pictures coming out of Gaza. And there's a reason for that, because they have what they need to eat and they have what they need to sustain themselves. But the hostages do not. And that's why the clock is ticking on getting them back.
How much has the stark appearance of those 3 men at the weekend fueled this anger and also fueled this latest unrest?
It's fueled a lot of anger, Nick. And I'll tell you, it's not just anger, but it's also what did Israel do for the last 15 plus, almost 16 months? Where's the victory that Prime Minister Netanyahu had promised the Israeli people? If Hamas is still standing, it's still able to hold these rallies. You see it in the images, dozens, if not hundreds, of armed Hamas men, masks, green bands, AK-47 Kalashnikovs, and then to get back hostages who look like Holocaust survivors, which, by the way, I mean, just to understand this, Israel was established to prevent these images from ever taking place once again. The never again vow was so these images would never be seen again. And then Israeli people see this and they say, okay, so what has happened to us as a country? What has happened to our military? What has happened to our leadership? There's a great crisis right now within the Israeli people, definitely with leadership, but also with what are the goals now of this war.
You wrote, while Israel slept, how Hamas surprised the most powerful military in the Middle East. If it gets back on a full war footing as of 1 minute afternoon on Saturday, what do you foresee coming, Yaakov?
I think that, as the prime minister promised in the cabinet meeting yesterday, it will be intense fighting. Israel will be taking off the gloves even to a greater extent than before. And part of the reason for that, Nick, is listen to what Donald Trump is saying. He's basically giving Israel the full backing to go back to fighting, very different than what we saw under the Biden administration, where there was a lot of yes, but also a lot of no. And it was a lot of stopping Israel along the way. Here we have a different administration that has not only renewed arms supplies to Israel, some of those bombs that the Biden administration had withheld are now being supplied, but also a lot of diplomatic cover that Israel was lacking in the previous government, in the previous president by Biden. So now that they have that, I would think that this would be intense. It would be more devastating for Gaza, and it would lead eventually, hopefully, to the removal of Hamas from power in Gaza.
Enjoyed our time together. Thank you. Yaakov Katz, former editor of the Jerusalem Post, senior fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute. That book again, While Israel Slept, How Hamas Surprised the Most Powerful Military in the Middle East. Well, let's look at the possibility of negotiations or diplomacy. Nomi Bar Yaakov is international negotiator and expert in diplomacy in the Middle East and a fellow at the Geneva Centre for Security Policy. Is time running out for any form of negotiation here, in your view? Good morning.
Good morning, Nick. Well, we're at a pivotal moment, terrible times, and no one really knows whether the negotiators will succeed in overcoming this particular hurdle. It's been, the negotiations are obviously very intense. It's not clear how many hostages will need to be released on Saturday in order for the ceasefire to hold. That said, there is really no knowing at this stage how it's going to go, but the pressure is on Hamas at the moment to release the hostages. They were the ones that said that Israel violated the ceasefire. Of course, there are violations on both sides. It appears more as an excuse, and hopefully Qatar and Egypt will manage to ensure that a sufficient number of hostages are released on Saturday and that the ceasefire will continue to hold.
What is the dynamic that the newly re-elected President Trump has brought to this?
Well, it's a very, very strange dynamic. It's a transactional dynamic. So he treats the issue more like a business than a ceasefire negotiation between two warring factions. When this is not a business transaction. You cannot threaten and threaten and threaten. You risk by threatening, undermining the entire process. That's where the problem is. So coming out with blank statements, I mean, there is no way Hamas will release all the hostages on Saturday. Even Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke of hostages as opposed to the hostages or all the hostages. The number, according to the agreement, that of hostages who are supposed to be released this coming Saturday is 3. There are currently 9 hostages, living hostages, that are supposed to be freed during the first phase. We're in the midst of the first phase, just over the half timeline. It's a sort of 3.5 weeks out of 6. And I think that if they manage to release 3 or maybe more hostages on Saturday, there is a good chance that the pressure will be on and they will manage to continue to free more. But the question is, the problem is that Trump is appears to be giving Netanyahu a green light to use, as Yaakov said, very, very heavy ammunition, more so than we have seen before. The arms, the 2-ton bombs that former President Joe Biden refrained from giving Israel after a certain point when the civilian toll in Gaza was crossed a certain line, is now in the hands of Israel. The shipments are coming through, and Netanyahu feels that he's got the wind sailing on his side and that he can take out Hamas, and that if it comes to that.
Okay, I must leave it there. Thank you very much for your time. Nomi Bar Yaakov, thank you. You're an international negotiator and expert in diplomacy and the Middle East and a fellow at the Geneva Centre for Security Policy.